So we'd like to invite Regina Paulose to present to do her presentation in the next 30 minutes.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
It's nice to see all of you, and what a very dynamic group and discussion. So I'll admit I am a little intimidated going into this, listening to what you all were talking about, but I think I'm in the right place. So what I'm going to do right now in the chat is just send you my personal contact information and one website based on the conversation you were having that you may be interested in, so that I don't forget to do that. But I'm not going to take my full 20 minutes because I am a very big fan of conversation and interaction. So what I usually do is I don't usually write my thoughts down, but for this particular discussion I did, because I wanted to make sure that I am clear about what I wanted to talk about. And so first, let me start off by thanking the organizers for creating a place for this discussion on these particular topics. And I hope to see more of these programs take place, particularly as it relates to Africa, because I do not think it is explored enough in the context of genocide studies. My interest in Uganda started off with the question involving the Asian expulsions and citizenship issues, which is often accredited or given credit to Idi Amin. And as you all are aware, the issue of expulsion and revocation of citizenship are common throughout the world today. And in some cases, these issues are directly linked to policies which further genocide that is already ongoing. The most notable example that comes to mind are the Rohingya people of Burma, who are punished and their citizenship has been revoked, but it is an ongoing policy of genocide. I was curious to see if that same situation was true in Uganda regarding the expulsions, and I was not able to find strong parallels between that situation and genocide. However, in the course of my examination, what I did learn is that there were likely genocides, but not related to this particular issue in Uganda. So this is what prompted me to want to bring this discussion to this particular forum. While examining the challenges of what took place during this time, I started to look more closely at the policies that were shaped by the first two significant leaders that came into power, Milton Obote and Idi Amin. And they are significant because of when they started in power, what they started while they were in power, and clearly have made an impact on what continues in Uganda today. And my presentation is going to focus on two specific themes that I hope will generate more discussion regarding the crime of genocide. My questions come from a legal lens, but I think since everyone here has an interest in genocide, the same questions could be asked, and given the interdisciplinary nature of this audience and the participants of this conference, we can come up with either the same or radically different responses to the questions. But I do think we can all agree that we will not find the answers today or tomorrow, but it will have to keep going. So I use Uganda as the example here because I know that there are some unique factors under Milton Obote and Idi Amin. I do want to make it clear that under both leaders, whether it was Obote Part 1 or Part 2 or Amin, it is clear that crimes against humanity was perpetrated, and I consider this to be just as significant as any claims of genocide. This is, of course, a new undercurrent that is beginning to surface in some circles in the international community, which is whether the crime of genocide should even exist. Uganda, like many former colonies throughout the world, had a political landscape that was shaped by colonial policies that pitted different ethnic groups against each other. These divisions may or may not have existed before colonization. It may be unpopular to say this, but I am not of the belief that everyone in the world was dancing on the streets together before the colonizers showed up. So as with ethnic groups in Uganda, like many other ethnic groups in the world, it is probably fairer to say that the colonizers were able to see or were told of obvious or festering issues between groups and use that information to their advantage to gain power and exploit resources. After the creation of the state of Uganda, these power imbalances did not go away. And in fact, it underpins the policies of both Obote and Amin. So then turning to this idea, I want to explore how are we evaluating policies when it comes to genocide, and policies meaning the actual overarching policies that are used by these governments. Do our perceptions of those policies change because a different leader is in power, yet no interruption of the policy has taken place? So in the case of Obote, he removes a legitimate power from leader, abolishes the Constitution, creates the Charter of the Common Man, and creates a formal and responsive military apparatus which did not question him and supported his brutality. Among his top-ranking generals was Idi Amin. And policies targeting ethnic groups were on the books under Obote. Obote was the initiator of the Asian expulsion policy. Both times when he came to power, he violently targeted Baganda peoples who once had power in Uganda. There were other groups on his hit list, and the violence perpetrated against these specific ethnic groups furthered the destruction of a group. He attempted to protect himself by putting more people in his military that were from his area, the Langi and the Akole peoples. And under his second round in power, he targeted the West Nile communities where Amin himself had come from. During Obote's first bite at the apple, Idi Amin was successful in his coup attempt and removes Obote from power. And under Amin here, we see no disruption of the policies of Obote, which I think is very key in this analysis. As a matter of fact, it is hard to find literature that indicates Amin reversed and shifted major policies from Obote. It appears that Idi Amin streamlined the military apparatus so that he would gain more power. He was the person credited for the physical expulsion of the Asians from Uganda. He was also responsible for the expulsion of different religious groups, which later Obote, during his second go-around, continued to do the same. So with regards to the ethnic groups, although Amin gained favor with the Baganda in order to preserve his power, he continued the policy of killing off potential enemies from opposing ethnic groups. He began brutal massacres in the military barracks, main targets being the Langi and the Akole peoples. And I have noted that these massacres are never classified in genocide as genocide in scholarships, but it classified as internal military violence or dismissed as just, problems that happen because of power. But this is a useful place to remind everyone that motive is not an element in the crime of genocide. It is, although it may be probative regarding the crime and its purpose. So we should also consider the following, which is that while Idi Amin may not have created the policy, he did continue it. And therefore, at the very least, maybe he was complicit in genocide as his actions focusing on targeting and killing the Langai and the Akole, regardless of whether they were in the military or not, was a foreseeable result of his actions. When Amin is removed from power through a coup, the Langai and Akole eventually are invited back to the military ranks by Obote and then proceed to target the people of the West Nile and the Baganda in retribution. There is no indication that any of these agents were free to make their own decisions. It is clear that the leadership, whether Obote or Amin, allowed this to happen with complete impunity. A second theme I want to take up briefly is how propaganda played a part in characterizing the actions of Idi Amin. While he spent much of his time in ensuring strict control over the country and his military, what is interesting is that he was characterized as aloof or had no idea what was happening or was lazy and not really as polished as Obote, and he did not appear to intentionally target ethnic groups. The problem with this issue is that he did target specific ethnic groups. Idi Amin appears to have used publicity and the rumors about him to create a public image that was filled with a lot of fake news. Yet what is interesting is that this fake news, for whatever reason, tends to mitigate the intentionality behind what he did. And it should be noted that much of the literature about Uganda and genocide, in many cases, labels the actions of Obote as genocide, but not Idi Amin, even though, as I suggest, it was the same actions and policies. Idi Amin did play to the international community's questions regarding his actions, but it does not appear any of those actions actually stopped his brutality. So in closing, I can comfortably say that I believe that there is a lot of information out there that is missing that could close the gaps on what was happening during the formative years of Uganda as a state, and whether these were true cases of genocide. So I cannot come to a definite conclusion about Idi Amin or Obote as genocide perpetrators, but it is clear that both appeared to have a policy of violent retaliation towards specific ethnic groups. And even if they were loyal to them, as it has been noted in some of the literature that the Akole and Lengai were loyal to Amin, but still were murdered, that perhaps the reason for the generalities made by most scholars regarding the massacres is a lack of documentation or proof left behind by both regimes. And we see the impacts of a lot of decisions that were made by both of them. But we do not have much analysis on the international crimes which took place during their leadership. Perhaps it is because their regimes are no longer relevant to most people. And to this sentiment, I would disagree. Uganda became a party to the Genocide Convention in 1995. It was one of the first of 60 states to become a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So it is clear that the Uganda of today appears to have a different commitment to international criminal law. But even though its past leaders apparently seem to dismiss this or not take it too seriously. So with that, I will conclude, and I am open to discussion.
Thank you very much, Regina Paulose. We have now time for questions, and she has indicated that she actually prefers discussions to just reading or just lecturing, which I also love. So she's inviting response to her presentation. So I did not quite, let me begin by asking you for more clarification. I did not quite understand the difference you made between Obote's violence and that of Idi Amin. So why was Obote's, Milton Obote's, why was it declared genocide, and whereas that of Idi Amin was not? I did not quite get it.
So, and that's a great question, because I didn't get it either when I was looking at this literature. I was really having a hard time trying to understand why it is that one leader was constantly pointed at, especially during Obote's second time in power. It's when a lot of people use the genocide card to label his actions. But Idi Amin does not have that. And I just, there was a book called Idi Amin that just came out during the pandemic by an anthropologist, and he didn't want to come to that conclusion. As a matter of fact, he kept kind of saying that, well, no, he didn't really mean for any of that to happen, but that doesn't really line up, because there was no change in any of the policies ever. So Idi Amin really just continued, or made it probably more specific than what Obote had started with, and he continued a lot of those things. So I think that's for me, that's the question of the hour. Why is it that one gets the label and the other doesn't? And I'm not sure why. And sometimes I wonder if it's because a lot of the literature indicates that the public preferred Idi Amin over Obote, but that has nothing to do with genocide. Whether the public likes you more than another leader is irrelevant, right? So.
Good. Sharon Bethia has her hands up.
I just have a question, and I in no way even begin to be an expert in Idi Amin, but I guess I have questions. It's like we kind of know, like I kind of put in the comment earlier that America is one of the biggest perpetrators of mass manipulation. So we're very manipulated by what goes on in other countries. So so I only know what I know from that in the books I have been connected to, but trying to understand who he was as a man, his time in the British Army, and in Kenya and other parts, and how even his childhood, because I guess when we think about some of the atrocities that happen in on the continent, and again, that sticks in my head around who the beneficiaries are. And then you talk about these leaders that are put in place that continue this these acts of genocide that actually is a long process. It's not just one day we get up like they do in America. We woke up one day in the news and it was happening. And so trying to understand that kind of trajectory, how even Obote and Idi Amin even got there. I don't know if I'm making sense, but just trying to even understand it all. Like, again, sometimes the literature sounds like, and I don't even like the word victim, but I'll use it just, let's blame the victim for what happened. And then we excuse the actual architects of it all. If that makes sense.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I guess how I would answer that is, I think because I did try to understand Idi Amin as a person, because I think there is a lot of mythology around him as a person. And I think that a lot of that is based on just people really having this, was he a cannibal? Was he, it's also all this kind of creation of an archetype of a person that he wasn't really any of those things. He was a person who strategically was trying to keep power because he wanted power. And I think Obote was the same, because Obote was actually put there by the British after they left. And but the Baganda king was the one that became the leader. Obote didn't like him, so he got rid of them. And so this is how we go. And the trajectory of the Ugandan leadership has always been connected to these guys. I mean, every one of them is connected to each other, and every one of them is a protege of the other, which is interesting, right? So to understand them, I think each of them has a different motive for what they do. But the policy, though, and that's really my focus, is that as they've had power, why is it that they kept the policies the same? What is it in it for them? And I know Idi Amin struggled. He had a love-hate relationship with the British, because he was very instrumental in the Mau Mau rebellions. He did absolutely do the work for the British. They loved him and the work that they trained him to do. But then when he comes to power, he doesn't like them, and he's trying to court all these relationships. So I did take that into account because I think it's important for us to understand who we're talking about when I wrote this. So I hope that answers it, because I think it's hard to just look at one piece of literature. And believe it or not, in the case of Uganda, this is really more of kind of the British and the Uganda relationship that's really more influential. Not really he didn't really have a relationship with the Americans. As a matter of fact, the second runner-up in that relationship is the Israelis, which I thought was very interesting, given the location of Uganda. I hope that answers, Sharon, what you asked.
Yeah, it leads me to, you try to figure out where to search. And so,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's great. So Barbara has a question. Dr. Scott, you raised your hand. I'm not sure if she hears us. Barbara? Okay, we can
It
go
was by accident. I don't have a question.
Okay, all right. Let me take this opportunity to tell everyone, if you want to ask your question verbally, you can just raise your hand. If you go to your options at the bottom of your screen, you can click on raise hand, and then we can, Salma will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to write. If you're like me, I like to talk. So,
yeah.
so typing my question, by the time I finish typing, it's almost like over. So, yeah, so please raise your hand if you have a question. So, since while we wait for other people to formulate their questions, Regina, I'm interested again in the impact of these leaders. Right now, I'm really interested in the power elite in all these countries, like the impact. So it's almost like they do what they do at that moment, and then like we tend to forget. And what you're doing here is remind us, like take us back there. And I really agree with you that it's the lack of resources, because we forget, and then there isn't continuous research that's being done to remind people, to carry it so that it doesn't happen again. As someone earlier said, one of the presenters talked about, if we don't talk about it, then it may happen again. So I'm interested in the local, like people locally in Uganda. Is there a feeling, is there even a group or groups who are really paying attention to this?
I can speak. I want to answer that first from the Asian perspective, in which I'm familiar with, and then see if it translates accordingly. But the whole colonization, I mean, it had spread around the world with different agents, right? So we had the British and everybody else. But in India, for instance, we had the British, and a lot of people will say, and especially like in China and all these other countries, they'll say, we don't need to talk about the crimes of the past, right? Because what's the point? Like, why do we need to dwell on that? Let's move forward. And so everybody's moving forward, which is interesting because when you move forward, the legacy of all those things also move forward with you. And I think that that is what makes me kind of wonder, right? When people say like, we don't need to talk about the past anymore. We actually do. And maybe we don't need to call it genocide, and maybe we don't need to call it all these other words, but we do need to acknowledge it. And we need to figure out what is the root. So a lot of times when I'm working on, so for instance, Burma. Burma is a really great example because it reminds me of Uganda in some ways, in that you have one predominant, I call them nations because the peoples themselves come from different ethnic groups. So this Barmar nation comes to power after the British leave, and they have kept their hold on power because they want a Burmese nation that is based on their ideology, Buddhism and everything else, to the expense of everyone else. So you have the Kachin, you have the Karen, and then you have Rohingya, Christians, Muslims, whatever their beliefs are. You have people who are sea nomads that are being persecuted. And so for them, the international community, if you look at the way they respond, they have only looked at this situation starting in 2016, because that is when they visibly saw 1 million people cross the border into Bangladesh. And they said, oh my God, look at this, what is this? But instead, what I always tell, my clients, and I always mention to people, that genocide started in the warning signs for that genocide started in the 60s. The actual physical policy of the genocide began, if you need a time frame, starts in the 1980s. So we had like 20 years of warning signs, and then we start this because it's as Sharon mentioned, right? We're laying the groundwork somewhere. So number one, I think the issue is I don't think people understand the dynamics of genocide properly, and most crimes. So, it's kind of like, I wonder, why do military people think it's okay to rape people in war? Like, what is that? What is the thinking behind that? Because that's not okay. It's not even okay in peacetime. And if you're not in the military, it's not okay. But what actually says to someone it's okay to do that in the middle of a conflict? And so I think there are conversations that aren't happening. And what I'm worried about is that a lot of people think that these are Western-led conversations, and they're not. They're just important conversations for us to have, because I think the women in Africa and the women in India and everywhere else in the world deserve to live lives where they're not raped, no matter what's going on. And that's not Western. There's nothing Western about it. It's about dignity, right? And respect. So the issue that I think is really underlying all this is, number one, is it a history that we're comfortable in talking about that won't start a fight again? And number two is how much of that do people think that it's propaganda? And that's, in a lot of the Asian countries I work with, people will say, well, this human rights thing, that's a total American thing. Not really. If you incarcerate 1 million Uyghurs and you tell them that they don't get to live anymore, there's nothing American about that. It's just wrong. So I think that's the issue. So I don't want to keep blabbing on, but I'd love to hear your opinions on that. But that's what I'm coming to. And I think it's a hard question.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's one more question. I think a person wrote here, there are reports of significant political repression against social justice organizations in Uganda today. Can you tie in Museveni's administration? Do you see Museveni's administration as a continuation of that historical pattern?
Yeah, he was a protege of Obote. So I mean, this is really we're just continuing on with the same structures. But the difference is what has Museveni learned? In my opinion, he's learned the language that gets him to the right places, right? So he's signed the right treaties, he's playing the game. I mean, they have the Kampala Amendment on aggression. I mean, this is what we're learning, and this is what the perpetrators learn. You say the right things and you get to the right places, and maybe then people will say it's okay. I mean, we just saw Putin do this a week ago or last week. Oh, there's a genocide, we have to go in there.
Right.
He just said the word and that was it, right? Like he just went flying in there. And I think that's what's happening is, you know, so I think Museveni, I don't see a disconnect between him and the people that came before him, which makes it all more important for, I think, us to talk about the past. And I do know that his opposition groups who ran against him are claiming that these elections aren't even fair because he has continued on the same structure as Idi Amin and Obote before him.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and I said to Barry, Ibrahima is raising a question.
No, I don't really have a question. If a person have a question, I would give it. It's just to add on your point.
Yeah, I see Rebecca, I think, has a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think Rebecca has a question here.
Rebecca?
Yes,
Okay.
I can read it. How do we separate this Western ideology of human rights from basic level understanding of right and wrong and human dignity?
Yeah, so I was just actually going to respond in writing to that because I wasn't sure if we were going to get. So what I will say is this, I believe, and I could be wrong, I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm almost positive in every culture in the world, there's a concept of dignity that exists and a concept of respect. And I think the way to de-Westernize this idea is to use those concepts in those cultures and promote that. And that is exactly what I had mentioned in the chat before about the Congress of Nations and States, because that's what that movement does, is it brings the nations from around the world to sit on equal footing with the states to say, okay, you want to address climate change? Well, we have the way we do it, and you need to listen to us because you're on our territories doing this nonsense that you're doing. So we got to all be part of the conversation. So I think that's what I would think would be the way to move that forward, because I don't think there's any culture in the world that doesn't have those ideas. Whether or not it's a literal translation is a different story, but it's the same thing. On human rights is dignity, respect, and then I'm sure in every culture as well, there's a concept of justice. And sometimes I think we have to promote that instead of using the colloquial terms that we're using, which is why people think it's a Western thing.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm so glad and delighted that you about your latest comment, because that's it echoes what I articulated in my most recent book on human rights. You know, so where I basically argued that it's human rights is a human thing. It's in every culture, you know. So the West articulated it in their own way, but there's this respect for dignity in every culture, and we cannot just outsource this respect for individuals that exist in our culture to the West. Yeah, so I love how you articulated it. Thank you very much. So it looks like we have run out of time, and I thank Regina Paulose for this wonderful presentation that takes us back to our core issue of how to protect this animal called a human being. So, and how to prevent arbitrary killing of people. So thank you very much, and I thank all of you for this wonderful day. It's been rich in ideas, in conversation, in practice of Ubuntu, and every other thing you want to add to it. So in my own position as the MC of this of today's session, I thank you from my heart, and hope that you come back tomorrow for another promisingly beautiful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
this
you,
was
everyone.
wonderful. We learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
And
See
I
you
also
tomorrow.
want to say, really, thank you for the presenters for accommodating our hiccups. I really, really appreciate you. It was last minute, but you rolled with us. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.